Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Welcome to Magic in the Room. My name is Ben West.
And I'm Luke Freeman, and thank you for joining us today. Fun stuff today. Going to get a little crazy here with organization design and leadership behaviors. And I'll just start with the end here. Start with the end in mind. My question is, what comes first? Leadership behaviors that create a truly transformational organization, or a system, an organization that's a little further along in its story and really transforms lives for people, and it creates transformational leaders. So I don't know if we're going to figure that out, but
I don't know either.
We'll talk about it.
But I'm curious to know where we end up.
We'll find out. So, okay, let me give us some baseline here. So today we're going to be talking about transformational organizations and leaders versus transactional organizations and leaders. And I want to start with just a definition. What does that mean? So Ben, when you hear the word transactional, what comes to mind? How would you define that?
Yeah, for me, when I think of transactional, it's I give you something, you give me something. End of story. There's nothing more to it except for that.
Yeah, and when we apply that to leadership and organizations, we'll talk through what that looks like in a little bit. But it really is, I give you this as an organization, and I expect this output.
Yep.
So I give you an input. Might be a salary, might be a place to sit and stay warm, might be direction, and I expect a certain output out of you. All right. How about transformational?
Yeah. So transformational definitely indicates some sort of change. And so there's something in it that changes the people, that changes the organization. And I don't know, maybe I would even, depending on the context, we'd say changes the community and the world around it too. So transformational has something to do with something becoming something different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember when I was in school studying organizational design and the psychology of leadership, I kind of struggled with understanding, because we went through all the different theories of leadership, servant leadership, and this, that, the other. And we got to transformational leadership, and I was like, well, I don't really get it. I know what something to transform to another thing means. I've watched Transformers as a child of the 80s, but I didn't understand what it meant in the leadership context. And I had to dig in a little bit to really get to this point of understanding, when we say transformational leadership or a transformational organization, what we mean is a team or a leader or an individual who, because of their experience in that context with a leader, with an organization, can perform beyond their perceived capabilities. So it's really, can they perform beyond the resume, right? And transformational leaders are people who believe that there is a innate level of potential in everyone for greatness. Now, greatness might look different for everyone. It does look different for everyone. But a transformational leader believes that there's that potential inside people and seeks to bring that potential out. And an organization that's transformational is designed in such a way that it expects, and maybe expects is the wrong word, it almost hopes that whenever people enter as a team member, employee, whatever, that they would be able to perform beyond their perceived capabilities.
Yeah. I think it's not surprising that it takes a little while to kind of think through this, because all of the defining things about jobs are transactional. It's a job description. When we apply for a job, it's what's the job description. And then even in the most, I don't know, maybe this isn't true, but probably even in the most transformational organization you can possibly think of, there's still a paycheck every 2 weeks,
Yeah.
So our model is just very transactional, no matter what's going on kind of in the culture and in the leadership of the organization. We still see this very transactional thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's hard to quantify sometimes because, another way that we can tell if something's transactional or transformational is if the focus is on immediate self-interest for the people in that system, in that organization, or if the focus is on something besides immediate self-interest. So there's a longitudinal piece to that, is the focus on immediate self-interest or long-term payout that, it's fine that there's, a win for people. There's some self-interest at play. Or it doesn't have to be longitudinal. It can be qualitative, or even quantitative. Is the reward just quantitative where I get a certain dollar figure for the work I do? Or is it something beyond that immediate financial self-interest? And maybe it's helping me, actualize as a person, right? Realize my purpose, contribute to something that I want to contribute to. I think we see that model when we think about like a nonprofit or a religious setting.
Yeah.
Like people volunteer and they are looking for something besides their immediate self-interest, usually.
Yeah.
Is there self-interest at play? Sure. Right? People want to be healthy. They want to do things that align with their values. Yes. But it's beyond immediate self-interest in how they're engaging with that organization.
Yep.
So I think what's helpful to define this further is to really walk through different layers of an organization and say, okay, well, how does that show up in a transactional organization? How does that show up in a transformational organization? So the first one is really this source of motivation, which we already kind of started pulling the thread on. The source of motivation is my why. Why do I do things? Why am I active? And I'm going to say these are going to sound black and white, transactional bad, transformational good. But we know there's a lot of gray area, and there can be some of both in both styles of organization. So this really is, where do we lean and what do we want to create? So this first one, our source of motivation, why do we do things? Transactional organizations, fear is what's listed as the source of motivation. And by fear, that's not just fear of employees, it's also fear of leaders, fear of investors, right? And, if I'm afraid of having enough, if I'm afraid of my job security, if I'm afraid that someone's going to give me a negative review on my performance evaluation, if I'm afraid that I'm not going to hit a bonus, right? Those are all things that can be fear-based.
Yeah.
In a transformational organization, the source of motivation is care. I care for my teammates. I care for our customers. Yeah. I care for the people that I supervise. I care for the stakeholders to whom I have a responsibility. And that is what motivates my action. So how does that land with you? And, any examples come to mind of, organizations or clients maybe that we've worked with that you see falling on one end or the other?
Yeah, the first thing that I kind of thought about was just how fear is very broad. Like, we're all going to bring different fears. Yeah. And, one of the first things I thought of was just like the motivation of fear of losing a paycheck, because that's one of those core transactions. And so, like, that fear of not having the money that you need to take care of your family, like, it can be very motivating. But everybody brings kind of different fears to the table. Fear of a boss that's bad, fear, like all of those different things. So, but on the other side, when we talk about care, like, that feels a lot more about like value alignment. And we're going to get to, source of change, that values has something to do with that. But so it's interesting how it sort of starts there. Like, care is about the value that we place in something, that we care about it. And so it just strikes me that on like kind of on the transformational side, like already, even in this first one that you brought up, that fear is like this divisive thing, and that it everybody brings their own, like there's not kind of alignment around that. Whereas on the transformational side, like already we're starting to align around something, like something common, even on this, like just on the very first one, which is like kind of the way that we ordered it was the broadest one. And we're already kind of seeing that need for alignment around something. So that was kind of the first thing. And then, we talked a little bit earlier, and I think it's worth saying is that these all are going to kind of build on each other. Like if you're afraid, it's going to be really hard to get to some of these further ones that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. An example that comes to mind for me, and this one hits close to home for me as a, small business owner, is like executive compensation versus team member compensation. And so when I take scenario A, which would be, let's say a CEO who's getting 50 or 100 times the annual compensation as the lowest paid employee of the company, I do think there's some fear at play there. Like, if I'm that CEO, I probably have fear around, am I getting what I deserve? Mm-hmm. Am I being taken advantage of? Am I getting compensated fairly for all of my experience and skill that I bring to the table? And those are all real fears. I'm not trying to say that those aren't positive. Scenario B, right? Everyone gets paid the same. Could go pretty far on the other side of the spectrum. And I think for executives who say we all, and there are some examples of this, large companies where they say we are all going to get paid the same. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what role you have in the company. The only thing that I can come up with that would cause someone with the power and authority to make that decision is care for the team members that they have responsibility for and authority over, and care for those people's livelihoods and families. And so to me, that's a pretty stark thing. And again, this is not a value judgment. There's all sorts of different strategies at play and all sorts of different things that work well for people, but that's just a scenario, right?
Yep.
Okay, the second kind of organizational, facet, I guess, that we're going to look at here is what are the desired outcomes behaviorally from team members? What does the organization want out of people? And for transactional organizations in general, compliance is the desired behavioral outcome. And for transformational organizations, commitment is the desired behavioral outcome.
Yep.
So let that soak in there a minute. Compliance versus commitment. Yeah. What's that spark for you?
Well, I was thinking about this phrase that I think that Chris has said this a couple times. I think maybe it actually comes from Bezos, but this idea of like disagree and commit.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about this in the context of disagreement, of like, in a compliance organization, there's no room for disagreement because you just have to comply to the thing. Like you don't even get to disagree. Whereas on the commitment side, or on a transformational side, like it's okay to disagree because we can disagree. We can have that conversation and then we can still commit over the shared values that we have. And so I think like what's interesting about that to me is just that if you're thinking about change, like compliance doesn't ever bring change because you're just going to do the thing, but if there's room for disagree and commit, like that's going to bring change over time.
Yeah.
Whether it's just change in our relationship because we're willing to have the conversation, whether it's change in the organization because like I was willing to bring a new idea, not just comply. Like all of those things like are going to build a healthier organization through that dynamic of being able to have disagreement and then committing, which I know that that's kind of a narrow part of this, but it just was interesting to me how that whether you're complying or committing drives your ability to disagree about things.
Yeah. It's interesting as you talk through that. What stood out to me is this idea of where's someone's locus of control.
Yeah.
And, that basically means, do I have control over my own life or is my life controlled by external forces?
Yep.
And, with this idea that compliance is the desired behavior for me as an employee, that feels like an external locus of control where I don't really get a say in what I do.
Yeah.
A commitment is like, no, I get to choose, do I commit or do I not? So it is saying each individual has a responsibility or at least an invitation to commit to what we're doing.
Yep.
Thinking through examples of this, we, on an episode not too long ago, we had our whole session of worthy or worthless, and we talked about ESG measures, which stands for environmental, social, governance. If you're not familiar with that, it's just this idea that Wall Street, as shareholders and the general public's values change, then investment banks and funds and whatever, they try and hold the companies that they own a piece of accountable to what the public wants and what their shareholders want. And so environmental, social, governance scores have been created for publicly traded companies. So, I know people we have worked with have been involved internally in compliance activity to improve, let's say, diversity within their organization or environmental sustainability of their product services. It's one thing that struck me in being kind of on the sidelines a little bit, a little bit of a bit player in some of those conversations, is where's the locus of control? Is it we're doing this because it's what our shareholders demand and we need our stock price to be a healthy number? Or is it a commitment? Like, we believe this thing and we're committing to it.
Yeah.
And if we get scored for it, great. But, we really believe it.
Yeah.
And I think, you can do the same activity from a place of compliance or from a place of being truly committed to something.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned that these aren't really truly kind of hard, only one or the other, that there's some gray, some spectrum in this. So, like, in kind of your experience of watching that, do you think that having that outside force compliance can eventually change culture and it becomes commitment? Or is compliance from the outside always just going to be compliance?
So, we talked about this on the whole worthy or worthless thing. My bottom line is that if it improves lives, I'm for it. And so something like an initiative that ensures that there's a diverse candidate set, brought before every hiring manager instead of just a bunch of people who have the same background, whatever, I think that is going to improve lives. And so I'm for it.
Yeah.
Will that culturally change, the expectations of the workforce over time? Possibly. But I think we're kind of leaving it to chance.
Right.
So maybe not.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that the reason that you're leaving it to chance is because it's rooted in fear.
Yeah.
And so that thing that you're scared of can change and it doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
So
if you have a fear of being delisted from an exchange, you're going to do whatever, whatever's in your power to make the powers that be happy.
Yep.
And it's a challenge.
Yep, absolutely.
So the next one that we're going to talk about is performance management. So what does performance management look like in a transactional organization versus a transformational organization? So we would say that performance management is mostly about evaluation in a transactional organization. The next facet of organizations that we're going to look at is performance management. So we would say that transactional organizations typically view performance management as an evaluation process versus a transformational organization would view it as a self-directed process to some degree. So when you hear evaluation versus self-direction, what do you think?
Well, the first thing that I think is performance management as a title, a name of a thing, is very evaluative. Like even like the name that we give it kind of pushes us onto the transactional side, which I guess just is kind of an indicator of like how hard we're going to have to push against this transactional thing. If we're like trying to be transformational, like even the language we use is pretty transactional. So that was kind of the first thing I thought of just as we were like looking at this. It just kind of jumped out at me. And I think the other thing though is just that this is one that definitely feels like there's room for that spectrum, in the sense that like we do have to evaluate, are we doing a good job or not?
Yeah.
Like there has to be some standards, those kinds of things. But allowing people to kind of emerge that from themselves and be willing to say like, this is what I want to be, those kinds of things is hard, but super important.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to this idea of care
Mm-hmm.
and an internal source of control. If I care about a community, I want us to perform at a really high level.
Yeah.
And I know that we're all going to be better off if we perform at a high level. So I am going to feel the responsibility to somehow quantify that performance and help us improve.
Yeah.
And I think where this has gone off the rails a little bit is this idea of here, rate yourself on these 10 things on a 1 to 10 scale.
Mm-hmm.
We know based on some work by Marcus Buckingham and other folks that the minute you put like a rating scale in front of somebody, their brain automatically is like a piece of it shuts down and goes into defense mode.
Right.
And we didn't know that before. We didn't have like great imaging MRIs to test all like performance management 50 years ago. So it's fine. But, people are a little surprised when they say, hey, if you had, free reign and you were going to design a performance management system, like what would you do? And I say, well, you probably have to identify a few KPIs and track those.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, I would check in with people like once a month and say, hey, which of our core values do you feel like is a strength for you?
Yeah.
And how do we leverage that more as an organization? And which of our core values do you think is something that maybe isn't as natural for you? And like, what can you do and how can I support you, as you continue to grow in that?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of it.
Yeah.
And then give me feedback.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people are like, well, like, I don't know. It says it's not enough. Like, don't we need some forms and don't we need to track it? And like, maybe, yes. I would say we need forms mostly to hold leaders accountable so that they're actually doing check-ins.
Right.
Yeah. Way more so than for the, individual contributor team members. But yeah.
Well, and part of what's interesting about that is the more people understand the values and the more people understand like the models that are going to bring success, then the more they can be self-directed. Because if I understand the service profit chain, for example, like if I understand that and I'm in an organization where that applies, then I can be very self-directed to say, well, I need to focus on team member experience because I understand the model that will lead to increased revenue if I do that.
Yeah.
But if I don't understand that model, then like I'm just kind of left shooting in the dark to decide where I should focus. And so it just strikes me that performance management is largely about people understanding their job, how they fit into the system, what the model of the organization is, what the values are, and then we'll get to this, but being kind of coached through how those things all fit together and understanding it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people might laugh at this, but there really are people that do not know that being rude to a customer is bad for business.
Mm-hmm.
Like really, there's folks that don't know that.
Yeah.
Whether it's because of how they grew up or like other, cultural things or just not thinking about it and not being aware.
Yeah.
And to be able to say, here, this is how we behave to one another and how we behave to everyone we come into contact with. and help them think through that and process it and internalize it rather than you get it too.
Right.
Yeah. That's transformational.
Yep.
And I'm going to go back. Like, what's the definition of transformational? It's seeking to help teams, organizations, leaders perform beyond their perceived capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're starting to get at, like, what are the pathways to get there?
Yep.
Okay. So the next one is rewards. So transactional organizations typically look at rewards for team members as being extrinsic, things like pay. Transformational organizations typically look at rewards being intrinsic, so like pride in the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
So, to me, this one kind of goes back to what we were just sharing. If you don't understand what we're trying to accomplish, how could you be proud at contributing towards it? So it's kind of on the leadership to say, here's what we're trying to do every day, and here's your piece of it. Thank you so much. Like, if we don't provide that pathway, that narrative, it's going to be really hard for people organically to feel proud of what they're contributing and work hard to contribute it.
Yeah. Yeah. This one, to me, like, I agree completely with that. And then on the flip side, I worry about this one when people, and you see this in nonprofit world so much, where it's like, well, sacrifice for the cause.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to pay you nearly what you're worth because we're helping the little kids wherever,
Yeah.
And so I guess I just worry about this one, like how it gets twisted and into like, well, we have this great purpose, we're doing this great thing, but you're, sleeping in your car or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I agree with it completely. I just think that poor leaders who are manipulative can use it for evil.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And not just on the transformational side, right? On the transactional side, we can use underpaying as well to manipulate people with bonuses, with, with being able to get a promotion and getting paid more, all of those things. Because if you are there, and the source of your motivation is fear to some degree, and the desired outcomes are compliance, and I say, hey, you could have more security with a promotion if you do this, that, and the other.
Right.
Like, the whole system's just primed for those types of things to be okay.
Yep.
All right. So the next one is like planning horizon and like the impact of the business. So I'm just going to call this one impact. In transactional systems, there's an expectation that impact is to some degree immediate. In transformational systems, the expectation is that our impact to some degree is long-term. I think of this, and I don't know, I would be really interested to talk to someone with more expertise than I have. I don't know if this is a necessary evil of transformational systems. Like, is this a weakness that we can only say that our impact is long-term because it's just so costly to build on the front end? Or, I think that's one narrative. Or is it a recognition that for someone to perform beyond their perceived capabilities, or a team to perform beyond their perceived capabilities, perform beyond what they are at face value, is not something that happens in a quarter?
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's a little bit of both, but that's where I struggle with, like, only long term.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter what business you're in, like, you have to do something today.
Yeah.
Not everything can be with a 1 year, a 5 year, 20-year horizon. So I think, to me, where this really plays out in, like, the people part of it, like, our business impact it's going to be something different depending on the business we're in and the model that we're using. But when we talk about people, and if we are looking at immediate impact, like, if that's kind of what we're thinking, then we're going to do leadership development in a day, which we know doesn't work. But if we're willing to do long-term impact for people, then we do leadership development in 2 years, which is what it takes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wonder if there's a little bit of separation in this one from like kind of community impact, people impact versus just like the business that we're in. Now, that said, I mean, the whole thing of, thinking short term for shareholder value, all of that has to shift. So yeah. I think, you have to look at kind of maybe different sections differently on this one.
Yeah. Yes, you can see me struggling with this because all day long people say we can't afford to do the 2-year leadership development thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there is just as viable an argument to say you can't afford not to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think there's a part of what you're saying that I think is informed by how transactional the ecosystems that we exist in are.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that's why we're having this conversation, is because there is a need for transformational influence on business and on leaders.
Yep.
But, it highlights that it's not without resistance.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge to move along the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The next one is, leadership activity. What are the things that leaders do in transactional systems? Typically they direct. So leadership in transactional systems is directive. Leadership in transformational organizations, their activity is more around coaching.
Mm-hmm.
So directing versus coaching.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Can you only coach? Or can you only direct? I mean, I know a lot of people only direct, so I guess you can.
You can only direct, yeah.
I don't know that many people who only coach, though. But when you see them, though, you're like, oh, man. Like, Sage, I want to be on their team. It is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Maybe the difference is people that only coach or only direct, like it comes back to this fear thing. Like you can maybe only coach if you created an environment that truly lacks fear. And I'm speaking this out loud, kind of thinking through it.
Yeah.
Whereas like we know that you're never going to get completely rid of fear. And so maybe there's always a little bit of directing. So that's one thought. But the other thought that I was just having as we were thinking through this is, we both have worked in ropes course world.
Mm-hmm.
And like there's no room for coaching somebody on like some proper procedures. Like they have to be directed. Now you coach around the why, like you coach around how to do it. Like there's definitely coaching around it. Yeah. But like ultimately, like if you put that wrong carabiner on the wrong place, like it has to be directed.
Yeah.
So maybe there is also something about, the type of thing that you're doing that impacts how much direction and how much coaching is appropriate.
Yeah, there's definitely some echoes here of like situational leadership modeling, where you're looking at the skill level and of the team members, and then the complexity of the task, and trying to decide how you show up as a leader in that setting. So I think you're right. But also when I look at situational leadership model and I look at like the coaching quadrant of it, apologies, we'll put a link if people are like situational. Oh, I thought we were talking about transformational. Why are you just throwing another thing in here? We can put a link in, but I see a lot of people in the quadrant that's directive. I don't see many people showing up in the coaching quadrant consistently. That's 80% of what they do. I don't see it. And I think my takeaway is that if you're in a space where you have highly skilled people doing cool stuff, I would encourage you to flex into coaching more. Yeah, because the outcomes are huge. Yeah. Man, the thing that comes to mind is like if you're in an incubator space where 90% of your projects aren't going to have ROI, you should only be coaching people Like, just coach and get all their creativity out on the table. And if you feel like you have to be directive in that setting, you're probably mismatched maybe. Or if you have a leader in that role that's doing directive type work, you probably put the wrong leader in that role.
Right.
You need to upskill them, or you need to pull someone in who's a good coach. So yeah, my takeaway is like, yes, this is situational, but also like it's kind of similar to what we talked about before. It feels extremist to talk about these transformational things sometimes. I don't think it should. I think it should feel like yin and yang more so than crazy, out of left field approach. And then this is what 99% of people do.
Yeah.
Okay. Next up, and this is our last one, is what is the source of authority inside the organization? What's the source of authority? And for transactional organizations, rank or position. This is where it gets like hit super close to home for me. For transformational organizations, character and competence is the source of authority. Thoughts?
I'm curious, why does it hit really close to home for you?
Because we've been having this big conversation about character, and I don't know, it's a theme. Like, it's a theme for me. Maybe it's my 2022 theme. I'm not sure. This idea of character. And I think for me as a leadership development guy, I spent a lot of time thinking about competence and skilling up people. And was I developing character along the way? I think I was. I don't think that's been a blind spot necessarily. But I think I relied on some technique, whether that's training technique, the experiences participants had, whatever, to build character rather than just being bold enough to say being a leader is about being someone of character. And you can't skill that need away.
Yeah.
And, it's also a theme. We go back to that, environmental social governance conversation that we were having. When I look at people who don't have an internal locus of control and are doing activity like that because the market is demanding it, I hesitate to say this because it might hurt someone's feelings, but I can't think of any reason why it's not true. So I'm going to say it anyway. I think doing that work out of a place of compliance is outsourcing your character. You're outsourcing what you believe to the marketplace. And the more I reflect on it, the more I have a hard time swallowing that. So for this one, source of authority. Yeah, that's why it hit home for me.
I mean, it strikes me that, again, we kind of come back to fear, right? Like, if you are outsourcing your character because you're going to get delisted, then, it circles back to fear. And kind of the same thing with rank and position. Like, if the source of authority is rank and position, like, the only way to move to the other side, to character and to competence, is to like create an environment where you lower anxiety and get rid of fear, which, like, what leader that has all of the rank and position is going to want to do that?
Yeah. I mean, those people are the people who are in history books, though.
Yep.
The people who had the position and freely gave it away.
Yep.
Are the ones that
we still talk about.
That we talk about. And there's a reason that we can call them by name. There's not thousands that would be hard to memorize. The people that come to mind, are few and far between. And, it goes back to that idea of, and I know compensation, it's a very simplified example, but this idea of the CEO who says, I'm going to make the same as the janitor versus the person making 100x of the janitor. You hear me struggling with it, but I do think there's a character component to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yes, there's all sorts of mitigating, all sorts of things. I'm not trying to oversimplify, but there still is something in there around, do you only have power because of your position? Or can you positionally be pretty equal with everyone and still have power because you're competent? You've been there, and you're a trusted guide. You have the character to be a trusted guide to your peers into what's next for you.
Yeah. Which I think kind of brings me to one of the questions that I know you were going to get us to, but it kind of leads me here is, if you are somebody who like has, you are a trusted guide, like you want to kind of exist in that character and competence space, and you walk into an organization that's very transactional, like, are you going to get changed, or can you change the organization? Like, is this about the system that people exist in, or is this about the people that exist in the system?
Yeah. So I'm going to start like super practically. I think it is very common for us to run across people in our work who take a transformational approach, who are driven by a need for care, but who also have essentially built a wall around their team, or a dam from keeping stuff from coming downstream to their team, where they create this little oasis inside a transactional organization that feels pretty transformational. Now, typically those people do find success, I think, unless they don't have political savvy to go along with their transformationalness. So there's kind of two types of transformational leader, the ones who have the political savvy to create that transformational oasis and navigate through the organization successfully, and maybe move up and create larger and larger oases, eventually get to that top of the rank and position and can really make some big change. And there's the ones who create that oasis, but it's not sustainable, and it doesn't grow, and it can't replicate because they, for no fault of their own, they're not born to play the political game that sometimes it requires in a transactional organization. So
yeah, I had a little bit of a similar thought of, I think a lot of it depends on the size of the system. Yeah, because I can think of an organization that I've kind of watched, and I think that has probably become more transactional because of a leader who just kind of had a transactional approach. But the system isn't very big, and so that leader has kind of outsized influence on the whole organization. But like comparatively, that whole organization would be, a small team in a big organization. And so there is something about the size of the system and how you're able to kind of isolate the parts that you have influence on.
Yeah. And to go back to your question about like, can I just throw my hands up? I'm unfairly interpreting your question. Can I just get to make the excuse and throw my hands up and say, sorry, I'm in a transactional organization. This is how it is. I got to get paid. Like this is it. I can't make change. No, like I don't believe that. Right. I think that everybody has power to be intentional with what they do and how they do it. Yeah. I also believe that everyone can grow. So, leaders who want to build an oasis in a transactional organization, or want to push their entire organization further towards the transformational side of the spectrum, I think every individual has personal responsibility to do that. And, we're hitting on this whole outsourcing of our character thing again. If you really don't feel like you have that internal locus of control and that you truly can't chart your own path, I would challenge that and say, maybe you've given up a little bit too much.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that there aren't consequences for taking back and having an internal locus of control and making intentional decisions about how you want to lead and how is it going to align with your internal character and values. There very well could be huge consequences. But I think that we don't get to make the excuse that we just don't have control. So yeah, don't outsource your character. I mean, that's my takeaway. And I know that the next question is like, well, when do I know it's not going to work? And I think that's up to every individual.
Yeah.
Like some people do really well in transactional organizations being positive leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They've got what it takes, and they like it, and it meets their expectations. And then there are people that are just like, I can't do this anymore, and I'm going to have to look elsewhere.
Yeah.
I think there are some threads here to the great reshuffling, great resignation, all of that thing. There are people who said, I need to be in a place where I can perform beyond my perceived capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People have put me in a box. People think if they feed me a check every 2 weeks, I'll be their cog.
Mm-hmm.
I want more than that.
Yeah.
And so it will be really interesting to see what happens in organizations kind of in the US and globally. I'd say the next 2 decades, there's going to be quite a bit of fallout, maybe 3 decades, reaction to this whole great resignation thing. What types of organizations flourish, who can attract and maintain the right type of talent.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that in general, we will move down the spectrum towards more transformational attributes of organizations. I don't know how far, or how many will do that. So I think that all remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, I think for me, if I was going to kind of give a takeaway as we wrap up, and I feel like I kind of keep saying this, but if you are wanting to make that move to being more transformational, like you have to go and get honest about fear, like find out what's driving fear in your organization. And as you're rooting those things out, like you're going to start doing these other things, not naturally, that's not quite the right word, but to get rid of that fear, you're going to have to start doing these other things. And so it just strikes me how much fear can drive this.
Yeah.
And how much rooting that fear out, finding it, identifying it, figuring out how to mitigate whatever's causing it will probably get you pretty far down the road.
Yeah. Every transformation begins with the courage of one leader. I think that's true.
Yep.
Every change begins with the courage of one leader. And so if you need a little bit of help with that courage, reach out. We do coaching. Actually today, we're using a workbook, a field guide that we go through with clients and talk about, what does it mean to be transactional versus transformational as a leadership team or as a leader. Got some other leadership stuff in there. Be happy to send that to you if you want to shoot us an email. And just really appreciate you hanging with us today. So go out there and have a great day and be courageous. And thanks so much for joining us on Magic in the Room.
Thanks, Luke.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratteroo and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.